Okay, so I'm not going to do a review. I normally would go over the past material. We've only got an hour. By the way, I hope this format works for everybody. We could also do it in whole days, but I think an hour is probably better for you folks. And it'll take us it's about 16 hours of materials. I do about a slide a minute on average. And I'm just going to take us back to where we left off. I've been summoned to Barbara Mikulski's office, and she's mad. And the reason is that she asked me, she is the chair of the Appropriations Committee for the House, which at that time had the biggest leverage on the budget. She had asked me a year earlier, is it going to work? And the reason that she did that is she wanted to decide whether she's going to politically affiliate herself with the telescope. And what would you say? Could you say maybe? Could you say, I don't know? No, of course you're going to say that it's going to work. But I really didn't know because there was a key specification that was impossible to test before launch. So if you go out and look at the sky in a clear place with dark skies, you'll see the stars are twinkling. The stars aren't changing. What's happening is that the variations in the light density are refracting the light, and it's switching on and off of your retina. So Hubble Space Telescope, in order to reach what is called its highest resolution, it's called the diffraction limit. It's a physical limitation on resolution as a function of the diameter of the aperture. It has to be held very steadily, just like your camera. And the real benefit of Hubble going into space is not any kind of diminution in the intensity of light. It's getting rid of this refractions of light. So how steady does it have to be to achieve its full goal? It has to be stable with a 7,000th of an arc second for 24 hours. Now, most of you probably don't think in milli-arc seconds. So that's the angle that would be made if you could put a laser on the Washington Monument and illuminate a pearl on top of the Chrysler Building in New York City. It would never deviate off that pearl for 24 hours. This is difficult. But what it really does is it improves the contrast. Hubble is basically a contrast machine. That's how it sees things that are fainter than ground-based telescopes, which have much, much bigger mirrors. And the basic idea was to take us from basically 2200, which is legally blind, to a factor of 10 improvement to 2020. So if we fail this specification by only a factor of 10, we might still have the most precisely pointed things any human had ever made, but the telescope would be useless. So how do you do this? It's what's called systems engineering, and it's a big part of the program like this. You first build an analytical model of the telescope on a computer. This just shows a little hypothetical spreadsheet. Then you put requirements on each of the subsystems. For example, this is the mechanical subsystem that holds a secondary mirror. It's carbon epoxy. Then you measure its actual performance in a test. Then you put the actual data back in the model. Do that with every element of the system. There's reaction wheels to turn it, gyroscopes to measure its rates, instruments to take science data, fine guidance sensors to use distant stars for stabilization, then all the electrical components. When you do this correctly, it all works, but you don't know, there's no way to suspend it and simulate zero gravity and test it. We hate this kind of idea. So it did work. The irony in Hubble is all the hard parts work. The failure was the simplest part, fabricating a standard reflecting mirror. So when I meet with her, she sticks her finger in my chest and says, there'll never be an appropriated dollar to fix this telescope. This is a nightmare that has to go away. She was in blamer state. We're going to spend a lot of time looking at drama states as we go through here. And Administrator Truly was with me, only the two of us in her office. And he's a really great guy, former admiral. I'm fond of him. I couldn't find a picture of him looking mad, so I made this overlay. And we get back in his car and drive her to go back to headquarters. And he said, Charlie, you heard the Congresswoman that you'll never attempt to fix this. I just said, yes, sir. You treated him that way with respect. So I go back to my office, and I studied somatic psychology as a sideline some years ago. one of the things you learn to do is pay attention to your feelings. That is a great telegraph for how you're feeling. If you're feeling lousy, you're almost certainly in one of the 4 drama states. And the first thing you do is you belly breathe, which is pranayama in yoga, to minimize the effect of these emotions. Then look at the thoughts, storylines, and we're going to develop all this in much more detail that are powering your emotions. And the storyline I was running, I cannot act because Congress and NASA forbade it. I was in the state of victim. So what I like to do is to first inventory unfortunate realities. I do this with everything. When our house burned down, I did the same thing. The first thing is it's not a nightmare. It's a real thing, and it's not going to go away. It's quite easy for Dick Cheney to fire me if I disobey them. I remember what's called a senior executive service, and what they do is it's not easy to fire someone. So instead, they can transfer me any place they want at will. And when I was up in the administrator's office, we had a couple slots in the middle of nowhere. We'd send somebody off to, and there's nothing to do and just sit in exile. So that'd be easy. There is no idea for a technical fix. We're about a month into this, and the best minds in the world, I'd say, have been talking about this and working on this, and nobody has a clue as to what we can do. And I think I'm the only person that is able to fix it. I don't say that because of any special features of myself, but I'm in this position of controlling a lot of money and have a lot of motivation to do this. So the way you mitigate this is by thinking about it more deeply. And there is no remedy except a space repair. As far as Truly might fire me, I use the greatest mantra in the world, so what? We need to look deeper. There must be a technical fix. And I need to 100% commit to this. We're going to talk a lot more about this too. So back to what's going on with me in the drama state. I cannot attempt to fix the telescope. That storyline, that thought creates bad feelings and takes me into the state of victim, which is a state of self-induced helplessness. The answer to that is to shift your thoughts. It's easier to shift your thoughts than your emotions. The first thought is, I must fix the telescope. There's no other way out of this. I can fix the telescope, and I will fix the telescope. This took me out of victim into the state of responsibility, which means the ability to respond. And this feels energizing and good, and focus on what it takes to make this happen with action. So that's what happened next. So I think if you're going to be 100% committed to something, these are the questions you should always ask. First, is it the right thing to do? I don't normally share this, but I was very influenced by Davy Crockett when I was a child. And one of his slogans was, be sure you're right, then go ahead. And whose interests are being served? It's your own interest, then you shouldn't commit to it. There should be higher interests involved. And are you competent to do it? And can you tolerate the risk of failure? So these all were met by Hubble. I became 100% committed. And I like this expression from Bill Halsey, a great admiral of World War II. There are no great men, just great challenges that ordinary men out of necessity are forced by circumstances to meet. That's where I was. So I'm in my office just having come back from meeting with Mikulski, and I called my budget analyst, a guy named Greg Davidson, a really smart guy. And I said, Greg, I want you to find $60 million and put it in a slush fund. At the time, I had about $800 million for contracts in my program. But as you might expect, I couldn't find a single extra penny. Projects always cost more. This involved a lot of pain. I brought my staff in, told them each one what I'd cut. And ordinarily they would whine over losing 50 cents. And they just looked at me and didn't say a word. So now I had the money. And I said, Greg, you can't tell anyone we've done this because I've been forbidden to do this. And if you get caught, I'll provide air cover. I'll say I made you do it. He said, you don't have to do that. I'm with you. I'd already done the first servicing mission in space several years earlier with a mission called Solar Max. Had a very excellent team at Goddard that did this work. And I called up Frank Sepulveda, head of the team, and I said, Frank, I'm 100% committed to fixing Hubble, and I've got $60 million to get started. will you do this with me? He said, sure. And I said, by the way, you can't tell your management you're doing this because it's got to be kept secret because I've been forbidden to do it. So he said, no problem, I'll do it. Meanwhile, Ball Aerospace vice president was coming up to meet with me once a week in headquarters, said he was concerned about my mental health and all this. That wasn't a problem for me particularly. And a genius, Jim Crocker, a friend of mine who was at the Space Telescope Science Institute, were working on how to solve this. And they came up with the idea that if you could put another device in the telescope, the four main instruments were removable. They're about the size of telephone booths. They were designed to be taken out and replaced. You could take out one of the four instruments, and I knew which one would be easy to do. Put this in there in principle and position mirrors, very small mirrors, very precisely at what are called the stops. And one of the mirrors would be like this big and proportionally misshapen, exactly the same misshapen as the primary mirror. A second flat mirror, this could do it in principle. So they called me up and told me this idea. I was excited. And Jim said, we don't know how to position the mirrors. We got to figure out the problem. He happened to be at a hotel in Boulder that had one of these showers that went up and down. And he's looking at the shower and said, all we got to do is put these on little arms with set screws and stepping motors. So we had a solution. So for many years, I was pissed off at Mikulski for this. And a few years ago, some friends of mine were talking and said, you know, she really did you a great favor. Because what was also happening is the gyroscopes were failing on Hubble. And had you not gone very, very quickly, the telescope would go into a tumbling mode and the shuttle could never come near it. So if she had said to you, Charlie, go put together a plan to fix it, I would have done that. That would have meant waiting for hearings next year and probably would have delayed us 2 or 3 years and the telescope would have been lost. It actually gave us a great gift. And Hubble had its 25th anniversary a couple of years ago, and a lot of people watched films of me on science shows, one being a Hollywood screenwriter, David Figueroa, and he wrote the movie script for a movie about my life and Hubble, and here's what they call the sizzle reel. Got to find share sound. There we go.
Just so long.
Where's the beat?
Space Shuttle Challenger is just a few seconds away from blasting off from the Kennedy Space Center near Cape Canaveral, Florida.
What's happened? What happened?
Well, everybody here is open now.
Controllers here looking very carefully at the situation.
We mourn their loss as a nation together.
Challenger was the 51st shuttle flight. And NASA marketed the thing as routine space access and believed it erroneously. What do we do now? And we didn't know. I'm Dr. Charles Pellerin. I led the Hubble Space Telescope development program for 8 years. I think we may have been 6 months out when Challenger happened, and we got a now delay. I don't think you could find an astronomer or an astrophysicist who wasn't excited about Hubble. It's clear it's going to be a big deal. I wanted to have a low-key launch. I wanted to kind of quietly launch Hubble and make sure it worked. And this was a joke. 3 months before the launch, people are already lining up at Cape Canaveral getting ready for this. The Hubble family's out there selling their electrical connectors.
Dr. Pellerin, you've been involved with this project for 8 long years. What are your final thoughts on this night before we all hope that telescope goes up into space?
Well, Chris, I think I feel like people must have felt when they saw Columbus sailing off to discover new worlds.
It goes back to Jules Verne. You know, the idea of a telescope in space is something that just has a lot of appeal to ordinary people.
10, 9, 8, 7, 6, start, 2, 1, boost ignition, and liftoff of the Space Shuttle Discovery.
Hubble finally launched in April 1990.
Hubble telescope, the greatest telescope since Galileo invented the first one.
All NASA top management's in this conference room, and I walk in there and they're all mad and said, "How'd you let this happen?" I have no idea what happened. Zero. Well, you launched Hubble Space Telescope with a flawed mirror. And I said, this is two PhDs. I said, did not. He said, did so, did not, did so, did not, did so. I said, okay, stop, just stop. I could not believe it. I was really in literal denial. So spent the first 3 days and nobody knew what happened. Nobody could figure it out. The Congress has these hearings. Now hearings, no one's hearing anything. They should better be named as browbeatings or something, or bashings. So I get summoned to Barbara Mikulski's office, and she's mad. Barbara Mikulski was a congressperson at the time, and she was the chair of the Appropriations Committee that dealt with NASA's money. That's a more powerful job than being an administrator. She decides what money we get. So I walk in there, and she throws newspapers at us, and then she sort of starts screaming at me so much that spittle is forming on my glasses. She takes her finger and shoves it in my chest and says, "There'll never be an appropriated dollar to fix this telescope. This is a nightmare that has to go away." My first thought was, I can fix the telescope. And the second thought was, I will fix the telescope. We were all on fire. You couldn't keep us out of the office. Nobody had time for nonsense and review boards. You're not allowed to do this. I can't just give someone $50,000. I gotta go with a competition and a peer review process. I ignored all that stuff. He said, 50 grand, you got it. The images just blew people away. In our imaginations, I think we all saw maybe some astronomical image in a textbook or something, or a movie, and thought, well, that's kind of interesting looking. But the Hubble images were mind-blowing. Hubble was great science, but it did more than that. It took the whole world on the journey with it.
Perkin-Elmer's decision to complete the mirror without final testing is not communicated to Pellerin.
Perkin-Elmer stopped telling us about things that they thought would upset us that they could rationalize away. I was 38 years old when I got that job, and I'd never managed a multi-$100-million project before, and so I assumed the people before me knew how to do it, and they didn't.
Amidst the breakdown in communication, a serious flaw had crept into the mirror, and no one had realized it.
So how big was the flaw? By the way, I could talk a lot more about this technical detail, but I'm not going to. The mirror, the primary mirror, was 2.4 meters, 96 inches. The flaw was a gradual misshaping that ended up as a maximum of 4 microns at the edge. So how big is 4 microns? A human hair is 75 microns. So this was exactly the right size error that would be difficult to see in data and not ignore, and yet big enough to make the telescope catastrophic. How bad? This is a nearby galaxy, Messier 100, named for a French astronomer who cataloged a lot of galaxies. This is what a ground-based telescope, a really good ground-based telescope, can do on a good night of seeing. This is the best Hubble could do. I was arguably responsible for the biggest screw-up in the history of science. So what do you think caused it? Was it technical error or was it social context? What quality of people do you think worked on Hubble? I can tell you, best in the world. We had a rec for a Hubble job. You got hundreds of applicants. The best people in the world, scientists and engineers, wanted to do this. So the error was caused by misspacing a thing called a null corrector. This is a device to measure the smoothness of a mirror. we built a 60-inch mirror with this device. It's a very unusual thing, using mirrors instead of lenses, because we're trying to make ultimate precision. And a guy working late at night, all he had to do was respace it and change the field lens for a bigger mirror. He's working under great pressure. They're late. We're beating them up for being late and overrunning. The instructions were to put this cap on this Envar rod to do the spacing and to spray it with non-reflective paint. Well, he couldn't find the paint, so he put tape on it and cut a hole with his X-Acto knife and didn't realize he made a metal burr. So when he spaced it, the laser hit the metal burr and misspaced the mirrors by 1.3 millimeters. Now, what became interesting with the failure review board, I was the NASA representative to the board, was there were lots and lots of suspicious data in the testing. And they rationalized this with what's called confirmation bias. This is a very common phenomenon humans have. And the way it works is we tend to ignore the reality that doesn't match our preconceived notions. This is a common thing in aircraft accidents. So what they did, they saw an error in the mirror, but they couldn't believe the mirror was mal-shaped. So the mirror was now up sideways in its flight mount, which is a three-point mount. And they did a mathematical calculation, assuming the mirror was a liquid, which it is. Glass is basically a liquid. And they kept adjusting the parameters till they got that the sag in 1G would equal the error. They thought it was the mirror sagging in 1G, and they did this kind of thing over and over and over. Then they withheld these suspicious measurements from us. They never told us. I remember being in the quarterly review of the telescope, looking at these interferograms, and said, "Oh, it's kind of strange to me." And they said, "Oh, you can't understand it. It's a complicated thing." I said, "I've got a PhD in physics. I can give it a go." They just wore me down, and off we went to something else. So Lou Allen chaired the failure review board and went to the Congress to explain how we spent 15 years and 1.5, what would be $5 billion today. And he said that the root cause was a leadership failure. I was leader of the team, but nobody blamed me because nobody understood anything I'd done wrong, saw anything I'd done erroneously. It was typical NASA management stuff. And nobody understood how a leadership failure could create a technical failure. So the social diagnosis is the behavior at the contractor plant driven by a desire to avoid criticism because we gave them plenty. They overran. So they got nothing but pain from us. So I'm thinking about this idea and going back to my conversation with John Mather during the Kobe build I talked about last week. He said half the cost of a project is socially determined. I began to think there's something here to be understood about the social fields at work here. Needless to say, it was an unpleasant time. I avoided newspapers. I've avoided watching late night television. And I thought it was safe to go to Naked Gun 2.5 movie a couple of years later. So during the movie, there are two guys sitting in their Heartbreak Lounge talking, and the camera pans across the back, and you see the picture of the Titanic sinking, Hindenburg on fire, and the artist concept of Hubble that hung in my office. There was no escape from this. So we figured out the way to make the fix. I'm beginning to get the idea about social context, and I'm looking at the servicing mission and saying this is much more difficult than the original build. We've got all the complexities of the telescope's optics to deal with. We've also got EVA and astronauts and things like that I really don't understand all that well. So I went, but my hair's on fire. I'm pushing hard to get this done. This is the only thing I'm in my brain these days is this mission. So I put together the leadership team and I said, we're going to do two things. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to appreciate more than we criticize. I got it that if I had been more appreciative of PerkinElmer, somebody would have probably sat down with a beer and said, let me tell you about what I'm worried about with the mirror. And if they said that, we would do the testing, trust me. The second thing is you're going to have to be 100% committed. But by that, I mean, you're going to work if it's required, day and night, weekends. You're going to have to be as committed to this as I am. Anyone who doesn't do these two things is gone. And I replaced 2 team leaders in the next 3 months because of this. They couldn't do it. They couldn't appreciate, and they weren't committed enough. So, in your organization, do you reward people for fixing problems that they created? NASA promoted me up to the top of NASA when I did the servicing mission. And when that was about half done and clear it's going to work, I hated it. It's all politics. I like building things with scientists and engineers. I don't do politics well, never have. And for the first time in my adult life, I didn't know what to do with myself. So I got to thinking about this connection between social contexts and technical failures. And I got an appointment in the business school at University of Colorado, where I still live to this day. I began to study this. And I watched the repair on television, and it was beyond anything. Everything was beyond what we had, the maximum performance we could have anticipated, even to the point of making repairs down at detail levels that the thing was never designed to do. So people say to me, how could you leave it alone? Well, when I'm not there day to day, nobody needs me to be kibitzing. And the team I put in place after the first year and a half was excellent, and the same people stayed through to complete, and everything is good. So what about some of the images and discoveries? For me, one of the really important ones is the idea that absolute proof of black holes. Not only do they exist, but they're supermassive black holes in the center of every major galaxy. And this finding, which was confirmed by Hubble, which is quite incredible. So if you throw a ball in the air, it starts off with lots of kinetic energy, and as the potential energy as it transfers over to potential energy, the kinetic energy goes to zero, and the ball falls back down. So when I was in graduate school, we believed the universe is the same way. We knew about the Big Bang, fantastic acceleration, and everyone believed that just like the ball, the kinetic energy would convert to potential energy, then come back into kinetic energy, and the universe would end in sort of some kind of highly condensed state. What Hubble found was that after about the universe is about 13.8 billion years old. After about 4 billion years, it started to accelerate again. It's called dark energy. Nobody knows what it is. In fact, I'll show you later, we only understand less than 5% of the universe with everything we know about physics. So that kind of thing interests me. This is the Crab Nebula. It took beautiful images of this. It's not a nebula at all. It's a remnant of a supernova explosion. And the reason I find this interesting is that the Big Bang only made hydrogen, helium, and a little bit of lithium. The elements that make up this desk and our bodies and Earth and everything else were formed in these exploding stars. So we had to have 6 or 8, some number like that, of nearby supernovae to form our solar system. And this particular one was observed by the Chinese in 1054. But my favorite image, and almost everybody who follows this work's favorite image, it's called the Deep Field. There's a place in the sky that's absolutely black. It's about the size of an angle of a tennis ball at 100 meters. People had looked in there for years and years. The telescope science program was run by an independent institute that we funded. And the institute director had discretionary time. He was allowed to save this up. And after he had enough, 2 weeks of it saved, after 3 or 4 years of this, he decided to stare in the deep field against the opposition of the entire astronomical community. And this is what he saw. This is 2 weeks of what absolutely black. Every dot here is a galaxy. What this did, you can take this solid angle, count the galaxies, and multiply it by the proper thing for the whole sphere. And there's 2 trillion galaxies, each with 100 billion stars. If that doesn't blow your mind, you're not paying attention. So overnight, the number of galaxies in the universe went up by a factor of 10. And Eric Whitacre wrote a symphony about it, which would be playing if I was more diligent about updating these slides. So that's the Hubble story. Any comments or questions on this?
Yes, please.
Say again?
I say yes, please. Comment. I just want you to know, Charlie, how, since 2014 when we've met, how inspirational this whole story and the principles of resilience and trust yourself and everything. The role that played in my mind when I did the Long Walk project.
Great.
I used the Hubble as my analogy and metaphor.
Thank you.
And I just want you to know that for the rest of your life, this is an inspirational story of standing up, resilience, the same stuff that we have to do now in South Africa. But be sure that this was like always in my mind, you know, with what I've learned and heard from you. This was coming back like there's even no comparison. So just admiration for that.
Thank you. So every 30 minutes, we're going to get up and move. Remember our exercise, everybody on your feet. This is to clear toxins out of our body. I like to do these deep squats, but do as you want. These move the biggest muscles in your body. And by moving every 30 minutes, you clean your body, energize yourself from the sort of boredom of sitting and listening. I do these in all the workshops. We have a break every hour, so that's people are on their feet then, and then every 30 minutes we do this. Keep moving if you like. Sit still and learn is nonsense. So I found this phenomenon is ubiquitous. And this one's another very interesting one. Korean Airlines was crashing at 17 times international norms, and it went on for 4 years. Now this is incredible. Even a child would say, what? And they're crashing big jets. They're crashing 747s. We're not talking about Piper Cubs here. Soon, the president of Korea refused to fly on Korean Airlines. Saying, what did Korean Airlines assume was the difficulty? Technical abilities or social context? What do you think they thought?
Technical.
Yep, because that's all they knew. So what they did was they put pilots in simulators. This happens to be one in United simulator in Denver, which I've actually flown. My daughter's boyfriend is a United pilot. And I've spent a day landing 767-400s in Denver simulator, which is kind of fun. But the instructor's watching. And so they did passably well. So over and over and over, they put them in these things, tested them, and no problem. Finally, Boeing put observers in the cockpits to watch what was happening, and they were shocked at what they saw. The first officers ignored the captain's errors. When every pilot knows that safe flight requires 2 pilots, and typically one is flying and one is monitoring, the captain will decide which is which, and they normally trade roles every takeoff and landing so they both can remain competent to do it. And everything is cross-checked over and over and over. So what happened here? The Koreans imported Korean Confucianism into the cockpit, and this demanded deference, a very extreme form of Confucianism. And also, most of them at this time had military backgrounds, and so the senior officers had higher rank. Now, I wouldn't believe this, except I had 2 Korean men stay with me just free at the house some years ago that were in the U.S. studying English at the university. And the older one just berated the younger one unbelievably. I mean, the younger guy just took it. I would have socked this guy in the mouth. It went on and on and on. So what's the social cost? Demands for deference overrode judgment and training. So here's what's interesting about this. Once you diagnose the problem as social, the remedy is always very, very simple. We have the tools in this workshop to do it. They made everyone attend a CRM, which is a very common crew training program. And they demanded that they fire every pilot that didn't speak fluent English. Because if they started speaking Korean in the cockpits, they'd go back to their old local social context and went back to normal, safe flight immediately. So think about how many lives were lost that could have been saved much earlier.
Being a good pilot, we think, is a matter of technical skill. It isn't really.
But what about Sully Sullenberger?
Well, he's such an outlier to the theory of outliers. That's a very rare kind of plane crash. In fact, I don't know if there'd ever been a successful water landing in the last 50 years. Most crashes have a very different form. The overwhelming majority of crashes are the result of a breakdown in communication between the co-pilot and the pilot. Something comes up, a situation emerges that requires those two pilots to be in open and honest communication, and they fail to do that. One person withholds information, one person doesn't share, whatever. They're invariably social failures.
Airline crashes are invariably social failures. So a couple of quick ones here. I'm sure you know about the crash in Tenerife Island. There was a bomb scare in Madrid. The airplanes were diverted to a very small airport. KLM's most famous pilot, Captain Jacob Van Zanten, he's the poster child for them, put a 747 on the runway in heavy fog. After a garbled radio communication, he spooled up for takeoff. The first officer said, "Captain, I did not hear a takeoff clearance in that message." He scowled at him, embarrassed the junior officer. Second message came through. He did it again. The first officer remained silent. They collided with the Pan Am airplane, killing 583 people. The worst train crash in Tokyo, a driver overshot a platform, then wasted time trying to get the conductor to report a smaller overrun to avoid rehabilitation. Rehabilitation in Japan means things like brushing the track with a toothbrush for 3 months. When the train finally restarted, it would miss its 1 minute transfer time. 40% of the nation of Japan takes a train in ordinary times. And with typically 1 or 2 transfers. And believe it or not, I've been on Shinkansen trains that apologize for leaving the station 30 seconds late. It's punctual society. Exceeded the speed limits to get there on time, derailed, killing 106 passengers. Behavior driven by a desire to avoid punishment, the same as Hubble. Fukushima Daiichi. Like most people, I watched this with shock. The Tokyo Electric Power Company blamed the earthquake at first and the tsunami. I said, nope, it's social. It always is. The government convened a bottle of experts from Tokyo University. Tokyo University, Todai, is kind of like Harvard and Princeton and Caltech all rolled into one. A good friend of mine in Japan put me in touch with the chairman. He's a professor there. The chairman said the disaster was man-made and avoidable, including Japanese insularity. That's a very insular society. They ignored expert recommendations to move their generators up the hill and accepted unfounded optimism. It will never happen. Same thing as the crashing of the airplanes. Blind obedience to authorities, unfounded optimism overrode good judgment. So people asked me recently for a more current example, so I looked at the 737 MAX. This slide's about 2 years old, maybe a year and a half. 350 planes were grounded. It's so bad they're putting airplanes in parking lots with cars. There's no space anymore. So what happened? Airbus announced plans to build the A321neo with 15% less fuel consumption. That's a big deal for an airline. Most of their costs, maybe half the cost of running an airline is fuel. Boeing CEO, an engineer, been there a long time, ignored this. Our customers always buy from us, citing, if it's not Boeing, we're not going. Pan American CEO called him up and said, 15% improvements too large to ignore. Our next order will be for 200 A321neos. Boeing said, if you re-engine the 737, will you buy 100 of those from us? He said, yes, if no simulator training is required and you meet the schedule. What this is about is airplanes being types. So if it's the same type, you don't have to be retrained. Even more importantly, if it's the same type, different pilots can fly different airplanes. So if it were a different type, that would mean that you couldn't. I got to run talk to the tile guys. I'll be right back.
Larissa, are you still with us? I don't see you.
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, how are you doing?
I'm doing great, thank you.
Excellent.
Marissa, I didn't get a chance to say hello earlier. Matt Moran, thanks for letting me join your group here.
Oh, it's a pleasure meeting you.
Nice meeting you as well. And Darinka, I don't think you were on when I first came on either. It's nice to meet you as well.
Yeah, this will always stay like a fascinating story.
Darinka, we're not getting your audio.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry, say again.
I was on mute. My apologies.
Oh, Darinka.
Yeah. Hello. I live in Toronto, Ontario.
I'm from yeah, nice to meet you. I'm from Boston, Massachusetts.
And Darinka, from where are you?
I live in Toronto, Ontario.
In Toronto. Okay. I was privileged to be there. I'm from South Africa, but I was like there in 2019 in Toronto.
Oh, that's good. Hope we see you back again here. I've never been to South Africa. I hope to make a trip one time.
Oh yeah, for sure. For sure. Hopefully I will be in Vancouver sometime during this year at a conference there. So I'm looking forward to that. But it's more towards the end of the year. But whenever you come to South Africa, it's always good to meet and receive people from Canada, from America here. The next guests are lined up for next week. It's a highlight of my life.
Thank you. Thank you.
My wife is Canadian and her best friend lives in Toronto. So we usually go out there once every couple of years or so, and she visits us. So we were just there about 6 months ago. Really enjoyed ourselves. So it's a fantastic city. Lots going on and expensive to live, but most nice cities are. That's the way they are.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, we love it here. Lots of entertainment, operas, concerts, theaters, or all kinds of other concerts. So really nice.
Yes. Well, our friends, her best friend, they're Sikh, so we get to eat delicious Indian food whenever we visit because they know where to go, and they make sure that we get the best of that cuisine. So it's always fun.
Yeah, well, that's something about Toronto. When we travel somewhere, people say, "How was the food?" And we always say, "Well, I mean, in Toronto, you can eat just about any food from anywhere in the world." So
yeah.
You really have a.
I believe it.
Yeah, you have a trip around the world and you never leave your town.
Yes. One of my sons lives in New York City, and he lived in Chinatown for a while, and he made friends with one of the folks who was about his age, who had lived in a multi-generational store there. I think it was a Korean store. I'm not sure, but he basically said, I travel the world every day because people come from all over the place to my, parents and grandparents shop. And I learn about, what they've done. He says, I've never went to school like a block away. He works at his, in the store. And he says, but I've been exposed to so much. My son thought that was fascinating. It's interesting.
And it's really also amazing the diversity in the city as the time goes by. So now they say, I think over 40% of people living in Toronto were not born here. So it just brings a very different view of the world. And it's also, some years ago, I traveled to Eastern Canada, and over there was almost everyone is Caucasian white. And it was like
interesting.
after we joined, I'm like, okay, where's the rest of the people? It's just like you get so used to seeing the diversity that
yes,
it's hard to understand how somewhere it's not there.
yes. My wife had the same adjustment coming to the U.S. She's from Windsor, which she worked in the Detroit area a lot, but she's black, and she's used to interracial couples being very common in Canada, but it's much more unusual here. So it was a bit of an adjustment for her. You know, the amount of attention we would get sometimes when she first came over when we walk in somewhere, and it's gotten better over time. But her claim was that in Windsor was just very common. So.
Yep. Sorry about that. Had to take a break. So it's really important to them to be the same type. The 737 is an airplane I don't like much. It's designed for short hauls and small airports. It's a very unusual airplane. It's very low to the ground because in those days jetways weren't common. It's just, to me, it's a 707 fuselage. Uses cables and hydraulics rather than fly-by-wire, which other modern airplanes use. It even has paper checklists in a book, which most modern jets have the checklists come up automatically on the screen. And the way you get more efficiency, which is what the game is here, is with bigger fans. This is called high bypass engine. But the problem is this thing's so low to the ground, the engines didn't fit. So these constraints caused many improper engineering decisions. They had to mount them higher up and further forward, which created a torque that could tip the nose up. So they became concerned that during takeoff, when they're close to the ground, this torque could flip the nose up too much, the plane would stall and smack down on the ground. So they put in a thing called the Maneuvering Characteristics Automation System, MCAS. And this is unbelievable. What they did is they had a signal from a single angle of attack sensor to turn the horizontal stabilizer. The horizontal stabilizer is this big thing in the back here. It's got a little tiny fin on the back called an aileron that the pilots can use to move it. But if this whole thing moves, the pilots have difficulty controlling the airplane. And these angle of attack sensors are very vulnerable to damage from bird strikes or ground handling. And, you know, you'd never intelligently design a system like this to have a single point failure. And the reason they did is if they added a second sensor, this would change the type and require the training. Get this, they hid the existence of this system from the airlines. It was in the manuals when they first started, and then they took it out. So nobody knew it was there. So, but they also made, because it's changing this whole horizontal stabilizer, the pilots couldn't correct with the yoke. This was a great departure from Boeing's practice of enabling pilots to always override airplanes and do them manually. They proposed an hour of time on an iPad for training, and they pushed the development through at twice the normal pace, which meant parts were put in incorrectly, tools were missing. A massive case of confirmation bias. I talked about this before. What I mean by this is that engineers working at Boeing knew they're doing something wrong. They had to know, but they pushed it aside because of the social context of panicking Boeing management, probably threatened to fire them, whatever. Same thing as the Fukushima Daiichi reactors. Blind obedience to authorities, unfounded optimism overrode years and years of engineering expertise and technical judgment. So we are so tribal that social context fields generated by our behaviors powerfully affect others' behaviors. These social contexts address two deep human needs, two deepest human needs: to feel appreciated and feel included. And we'll talk a lot more about these needs later. They call failures when people ignore them. The three causes that I saw is obedience to authorities, unfounded optimism, which is the case for the reactor, Challenger, and the Korean Airlines crashes. Avoiding criticism is paramount, which led to the disguising of the error of Hubble's mirror flaw and the overrunning of the train station. inappropriate deference to authority, which caused the crash at Tenerife and the 737 MAX failures. So you should have workbooks with you. If you don't, I'm going to, I'll email them to you. I'd like you to take a minute. By the way, the workbook is in 2 different formats. And when I print the copies, I bind them all together so you don't notice this. But we're going to use the context shifting worksheet, that's what you see here, to actually process a real presenting dilemma that you have throughout this workshop. I often used to get plus delta feedback after every day. Most people get the feedback at the end of the class. That's not very useful. I got it at the end of every day. And early on, the big plus means what worked for you in the workshop. Delta, what would improve your experience for tomorrow? And the delta that I got very often was, we don't want a generic training. We want something that addresses our current presenting issues. And I already had the context shifting worksheet, which does that. This basically does the whole workshop in 90 minutes. So I simply incorporated this into the workshop, and we're going to do that here too, and have you work through something. So when we get through to the end of this, and sort of 14 hours from now, you're going to have knowledge of the tools, the ability to use the tools, and having used it to solve a presenting dilemma that, if it's not yours, is still a good example. And then other parts of it is are more in the regular portrait format because it's easier. You're going to be recording your personal experiences as we go through this. So I want to have you get to know each other a little bit here. And I want you to think about yourself. And if you don't have a workbook, let me know. I'll email you one after we're through. So what I found doing this for 25 years is the most important learning is experiential. That's what will stay with you. And so I'm going to have you do this exercise. First thing is to get to know each other a little bit, but there's a more important reason. And that is that not long into this, you're going to practice perhaps the most important behavior, the expressing authentic appreciation, and you're going to actually do it. And since you don't know each other, this is a way for you to know each other. Also, this gives you a chance to do something other than listen to me talk, which is probably takes a lot of energy and boring. So I want you to think about your character. And so I'm going to ask you to give you a pause, let you take some notes. We talked about the importance of doing the right thing. Are you able to address, we're going to call it, learn this is the green dimension, caring, empathetic, and appreciative. Address shared interest. This is the underpinning of all really good relationships. Are you able to give others a sense of belonging? Are you trustworthy? Are you committed to integrity? Keep your agreements. Are you able to face unfortunate realities? I gave you an example of that. Can you move into the state of focus with 100% commitment? And we'll be looking at that. Can you avoid drama states? This phone is clicking because they're going in and out the door, and I've got one of these fancy doorbells. I put this in the door, try and suppress that. So, and accountability. Do you choose to answer for the consequences of your actions? So I want you to think about writing down things that you do well, efficiently and successfully for yourself, interpersonal abilities, technical abilities, hobbies, and knowledge. So go ahead and write, and I'll bring up the workbook page here. If I can find this, let's see. It might take me a minute here.
I don't think I got it, Charlie. If you could send it to me, that'd be great.
I will for sure.
Thank you.
My oversight. Sorry about that.
I might have missed it, but I didn't see it in what you said last time.
Yeah. Let's see.
Charlie, if you have it in words, the documents in Word, that will also be good, seeing that we have to write something in it.
Do it. So here's
it's much easier than PDF.
Here it is. Circle things that you do. You might do this on a piece of scratch paper for now. you do efficiently and successfully in here? Are you mindful of how you affect other people? Your technical abilities, your hobbies, general knowledge, volunteer work. So go ahead and, if you don't have this document, go ahead and scratch out on a piece of paper, and I'll give you about 3 minutes to do this. Does that sound okay? So that's probably a little tight, but I want to keep my agreements and get us done on time. So early on, I had people in groups of about 8 or 9 people. I discovered over the years that didn't work very well. Small groups work. So I organized people to stand on their feet and face each other in workshops and just read what you wrote in your workbook. And if anyone ends up telling a lengthy story, just red card them. So why don't you go ahead and do this while you're with each other while we're here. So who wants to start?
I can go.
Okay.
So the first thing I'll say is I have a hard time talking positively about myself. So this is a little bit of a challenge. So as far as things that I kind of highlighted, self-management, it's certainly an area that I have worked to improve upon. I think, generally I'm a high performer, and I had a counselor once say, like, Nat, your 50% is like most people's 90s. So working to modulate that. As far as interpersonal, I've done a lot of work on that front. And this is, I think, part of that process, because Charlie, as you and I talked when we reconnected, my hope is to build more community. And that's obviously an area of emphasis. Technically, I have a big, deep background in finance, but Tanya, thanks to Tanya's coaching, my superpower is linking information to action. A lot of the companies I work in have tons of data, but they don't know how to do anything with it. And being a visual, spatial learner in a very logical, sequential field allows me to kind of bring a different perspective. And then I've done a lot of things over the years. I have a lot of diverse interests, played saxophone for 11 years, stopped that reason. Drums, cycling, swimming, you name it. So anyway, that's me in as small a nutshell as I can do.
I guess while we're off mute, I might as well. Makes sense. So what I came up with in terms of self-management, one of the things that I think is one of my strengths, and I have continued to work on, and I think it's important, isn't to me anyway, is I'm pretty intentional about my attention. So I tend to guard that, sometimes probably ferociously to others, but I am very intentional about where I place my attention. And sometimes I absolutely just want to sit and veg in front of the television, and that is absolutely intentional. And sometimes I will say, I'm not interested in doing anything other than this. It must get done. And so I guard that pretty intensely. And that can be good and sometimes not so good. From an interpersonal standpoint, I think, and I've continued to work on this, but I think it's also just a natural part of who I am, which is the appreciation of others. I do tend to reflect that when people are doing work, either that I've directed them to or on my behalf or just in a partnership. I tend to express a lot of appreciation. That's just what I do. There's probably a reason in my background. I think I could probably get there, but we're not doing therapy today, so we won't talk about it. Technical abilities definitely comes from the health sciences. I just naturally, I think I have a interest in health sciences, so I tend to lean in. I tend to be good at that. I tend to understand it. Also, I think as my career has developed, I think kind of process and product development is one of my skills from a technical standpoint. And then I think even, I don't know if this falls under technical or not, but practical application. So what? You have all of this technical knowledge. Who cares? So what? What are you doing with it? I am very much a person that's driven by practicalities. And so at the end of the day, while I love the sciences, so what? My hobbies, fitness, running, dance, tended to be good in all of those, love all of those. And I'm kind of one of those people, you love it, you lean into it, you get good at it. And that's as far as I got.
Good enough. So keep our agreements. I'm going to stop now. It's exactly 10 o'clock. We'll pick this up and continue next week at 9. We'll send out the workbooks again to everybody in both PDF and Word. Thank you all, and sorry about my interruption. By next week, we shouldn't have that problem again. See you soon.
Thanks, everybody.
Everybody.